Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel Sparkle English, where I teach you how to improve your English level. Today we're going to talk about the Oxford comma. So first of all, what is the Oxford comma? Well, the Oxford comma is also known as the serial comma and sometimes the Harvard comma. It is the comma placed before the conjunction in a list of 3 or more items. As an example, my new puppy loves playing fetch, chasing its tail, and chewing on shoes. This comma right here before and is called the Oxford comma. Now we're going to talk about the history of the Oxford comma and whether or not it is required. So the Oxford comma was first used in the early 20th century by the Oxford University Press. And it was introduced in their House Style Guide for academic and editorial writing to avoid confusion in lists, to avoid ambiguity, and make sentences easier to understand. So it's interesting that the Oxford comma is called the Oxford comma because it's not commonly used in England anymore. Now it is mostly used in North America. So if you are from the UK, you probably won't use the Oxford comma, and you might disagree completely with its use. However, in North America, it is standard in most of the style guides. So let's look at some more examples of the Oxford comma. The recipe calls for flour, sugar, and eggs. Again, this comma here before the coordinating conjunction and is the Oxford comma. And this would be correct in American English. In British English, this comma would likely be omitted. Here's another example. Remember to pack your school bag with a water bottle, snacks, and books. Again, this here is the Oxford comma after snacks. And finally, this summer, I plan to go hiking in the mountains, swimming at the lake, and relaxing by the campfire. Once again, here the comma before and is the Oxford comma. Now remember, we only use the Oxford comma in a list of 3 or more, not in a list of 2. So in all of these sentence examples, if I removed the Oxford comma, the sentences would still be clear. They would still make sense. No one's going to be confused about what I mean. This is why a lot of people think the Oxford comma should not be used. They think there's no point in using it. So I want to show you examples of when it is important and how it can change the sentence. So let's look at 2 examples of the same sentence, one without the Oxford comma and one with the Oxford comma. Joe thanked his teachers, Dr. Smith and Mrs. Thomas. So this is an excellent example of when the Oxford comma is useful. Because written like this, it appears as if Joe is thanking his 2 teachers. One of them is Dr. Smith and the other teacher is Mrs. Thomas. It's not clear if this is a list of 3 different items or if this comma is just introducing the names Dr. Smith and Mrs. Thomas. However, if we add the Oxford comma, Joe thanked his teachers, Dr. Smith, and Mrs. Thomas. This comma gives us that pause and also shows us that this is a list of 3 different items. So Joe is thanking his teachers and also Dr. Smith and also Mrs. Thomas. Keep watching because I will talk about alternatives to the Oxford comma to improve clarity, but this is just one example of when it's useful. Here's another more obvious example. We invited our parents, Ben Affleck and Jennifer Garner. So once again, written like this, it appears as though we invited our parents, and our parents are named Ben Affleck and Jennifer Garner. So this is a more obvious example because it's quite unlikely my parents are Ben Affleck and Jennifer Garner. However, it's unclear because we don't have an Oxford comma. So if we add the Oxford comma, it's clear that we invited our parents and Ben Affleck and Jennifer Garner. So let's look at some alternatives to the Oxford comma if you choose not to use it and you want to improve your sentence clarity. So again, we have this example. We invited our parents, Ben Affleck and Jennifer Garner. And let's say you do not want to use the Oxford comma, but you want to make your sentences clear. Well, you could just reorder the list. This is simple. We invited Ben Affleck, Jennifer Garner, and our parents. So now this is clear that you're talking about 3 different items in a list. So let's look at this sentence. Joe thanked his teachers, Dr. Smith and Mrs. Thomas. And imagine in this example, Joe only has 2 teachers, and their names are Dr. Smith and Mrs. Thomas. Well, this would be okay because the comma is introducing the names of his teachers. He would not use the Oxford comma here because he's only talking about his 2 teachers. But you could improve clarity here by adding a colon instead. Joe thanked his teachers, colon, Dr. Smith and Mrs. Thomas. You might also change the way this sentence is worded. Joe thanked his teachers, who are Dr. Smith and Mrs. Thomas. So in English, there are many ways to write a sentence, and sometimes changing around the order of the words makes things easier. So finally, I want to show you some more examples of sentences where I think the Oxford comma is useful. So when you have very short lists, like I'm going to buy apples, bananas, and eggs, the Oxford comma doesn't really serve much of a purpose. But when you have lists that contain phrases and they're longer, I just think the Oxford comma helps break down the list. It just makes it clearer that we have 3 different things we're talking about. So the team focused on increasing sales, expanding into international markets, and improving customer satisfaction. I just think it looks cleaner, it's easier to read, and that's a personal preference. Here's another example. Tiffany's new book covers themes of personal growth, finding happiness in unexpected places, and overcoming adversity. Once again, your eye just goes right to it. It makes it clear that we're talking about 3 different items. And finally, the program offers training in software development, project management, and advanced data analysis techniques. So once again, this is a personal preference. I always use the Oxford comma. If you decide not to use it, just make sure that you are consistent. And if you have a sentence where maybe your meaning will be unclear, you can just reword the sentence. And if you are a student and you're writing an essay, make sure to follow the appropriate style guide, which will tell you whether or not you should be using the Oxford comma. So now it's time for our quiz. There are 7 sentences, and you must decide whether or not the sentence contains an Oxford comma. So yes, it does, or no, it doesn't. Number 1. For breakfast, I had eggs, toast, and orange juice. Number 2. The report is complete, and we will send it out tomorrow. Number 3. She enjoys hiking, reading books, and watching movies. Number 4. My favorite cities are New York, Paris, and Madrid. Number 5. After finishing work, we relaxed and went out for dinner. Number 6. If it rains tomorrow, let's go to the cinema instead. And finally, number 7. The workshop discussed strategies for reducing stress, building resilience, and improving mental health. Okay, so in number 1, yes, this sentence does contain an Oxford comma. This comma here after toast, before and, is an Oxford comma. Once again, this comma is technically optional unless you have to follow a specific style guide. Number 2, no, this is not an Oxford comma. While there is a comma here before and, this is not a list. We use this comma because we're combining 2 independent clauses with a coordinating conjunction, and that's a different rule. But this is not a list, so this is not an Oxford comma. Okay, number 3 does not contain an Oxford comma. We do have a list of 3 different items, but this sentence has omitted the Oxford comma. So you can add an Oxford comma here if you want, depending on whether or not you prefer to use it. But this sentence doesn't contain one. In number 4, yes, we do have an Oxford comma here, right after Paris. Number 5, no. This comma here is not an Oxford comma. So here we have an introductory phrase after finishing work, and we use commas after introductory phrases to separate them from the independent clause. So this comma is not an Oxford comma, it's a different type of comma. Number 6, this comma here is also not an Oxford comma. If it rains tomorrow, let's go to the cinema instead. This comma comes after a dependent clause, separating a dependent clause from an independent clause. So once again, this is a different type of comma. And finally, number 7, yes, this is an Oxford comma. We have a list of 3 different things: strategies for reducing stress, building resilience, improving mental health. So this comma is used to separate these items in a list. Okay, so let me know in the comment section how many you got correct out of 7. And also let me know, do you like to use the Oxford comma? Why or why not? Make sure to subscribe to my channel for more English lessons. Thank you all, and I hope you have a great day.